You to know Colorado Christian University honors student Gillian Foster for the next introduction. Gillian?
According to our next speaker, those who self-identify as very liberal are 3 times more likely than conservatives to throw things when they get angry. Hopefully, Peter Schweizer did not find this out by having things thrown at him, but he does have a history of stirring the political pot. For example, the statement I began with is an excerpt from his book, Makers and Takers: Why Conservatives Work Harder, Feel Happier, Have Closer Families, Take Fewer Drugs, Give More Generously, Value Honesty More, Are Less Materialistic and Envious, Whine Less, and even hug their children more than liberals. This book title portrays his record of tongue-in-cheek rebuttals to liberals who make the ad nauseum argument that they're somehow more intelligent than conservatives. With a master's in philosophy from Oxford, Schweizer has proven that the pen is mightier than the politician, as several of his books are national bestsellers. His most recent work, Throw Them All Out: How Politicians and Their Friends Get Rich Off of Insider Stock Tips, Land Deals, and Cronyism That Would Send the Rest of Us to Prison, pushes for complete transparency in congressional finances, because his goal is to bring the political elite on both sides of the aisle back to the set of rules that the average citizen has to play by. Besides picking fights and exposing corruption, Schweizer's resume includes highly praised books on the Bush presidential dynasty and on Reagan's war against communism. Schweizer has also served as a consultant to NBC and to the Office of Presidential Speechwriting. He advised both John McCain and Sarah Palin on foreign policy, and he currently holds the William J. Casey Research Fellowship at the Hoover Institution. He also presides over the Governmental Accountability Institute, whose mission is to investigate and expose crony capitalism, misuse of taxpayer monies, and other governmental corruption or malfeasance. Schweizer currently resides in Florida with his wife and 2 children, where he's just far enough from Washington to not have things thrown at him by people he's made angry. Please join me in welcoming Peter Schweizer.
Thank you. Welcome. Glad to have you.
Thanks for having me. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. Great introduction. Thank you very much. That was a wonderful introduction. I do have to say that when I saw the schedule, the revised schedule, that I was following Star Parker, I thought, somebody doesn't like me. Isn't she incredible? What a difficult act to follow. Terrific. Just terrific. Well, it's great to be here in Denver. Since the release of my book in November, I have traveled across the country giving speeches and talking about political corruption. I've traveled everywhere from Palm Springs to Palm Beach in Florida. But you know, it was only when I gave a speech a couple of months ago in Washington, D.C., that I visited what is now the wealthiest city in America. Let me repeat that. As of last year, Washington, D.C. is now past Silicon Valley as the city with the highest per capita income in the country. And it gets worse. You see, if you look at the 10 wealthiest counties in America based on income, 7 of those 10 are counties that border Washington, D.C. There was a recent study done that said if you are under the age of 30 years old and you are trying to land a 6-figure job, the best place to get it is not New York, Los Angeles, Boston, or Denver. It's Washington, D.C. And in fact, to give you a flavor for how life is in Washington these days, Washington, D.C. last year became the city in America with the highest per capita consumption of fine wines in America, which actually may explain a lot. But you see, Washington, D.C. is a very different place than when I first went there as an undergraduate student in the 1980s. It is no longer a town of middle-class bureaucrats who sit somewhere in a large building and get paid a small salary to do what they do. Washington, D.C. is in many ways the new Versailles of America. This is where wealth is being taken and people are becoming fabulously wealthy. Washington, D.C. now has a Ferrari dealership, a Maserati dealership, and a Lamborghini dealership. There's an executive airport near Washington, D.C. in Leesburg, Virginia, that has 70,000 airplanes, private jets, taking off and landing every single year. No, this is not the Washington that was once the diplomatic back hole where so many foreign diplomats didn't want to reside. This was and is now a city, a capital city, that is increasingly resembling an imperial city. And I'm going to argue to you today that there is a divide in America between conservatives and liberals, but I'm going to contend to you that the biggest divide, perhaps the one that's most important, is the divide between Washington, D.C. and the rest of the country. And the reason I say that, thank you. The reason I say that is because what is going on in Washington, D.C. offers a microcosm of the real problem as government grows and becomes bigger. And that is that you get rampant insider dealing, rampant cronyism, and rampant corruption. Now, I became interested in this topic a couple years ago when I noticed two things. The first thing I noticed is that there were lots of people that were going into office in Washington, D.C. in the name of public service, and there are good people there. You've heard from some of them this weekend. But there were a lot of people going to Washington, D.C. in public service, and within a matter of decades, they were fabulously wealthy. Let me just give you two illustrations, one from each political party. Nancy Pelosi came to Washington in 1987. She and her husband had a net worth of about $3 million. Over the next 20 years, it went up 867%, which means they're averaging about 24% return on their investment every single year. That's pretty impressive. I don't know if there's anybody out here that can match that. I doubt there is. Let me give you another example. Dennis Hastert, Republican Speaker of the House from the state of Illinois. When he became Speaker of the House in 1998, his net worth was $300,000. Less than a decade later, when he left, his net worth was around $7 million. No, he did not have a rich uncle that died. No, he did not win the lottery. He engaged in what I call the land deal. Both Pelosi and Hastert are examples of how in Washington, D.C., wealth accumulation has become dramatic. In fact, there have been studies done that show politicians in Washington, D.C. accumulate wealth 150% faster than the rest of America. And I want to take a little time today to tell you exactly how they do it. Now, keep in mind, what I'm going to be describing to you today is not illegal. In fact, the ethics committees in Washington, D.C. will even declare that the behavior is ethical. Of course, that's their standard, not ours, because a lot of what I'm going to describe, I'm going to encourage you to not do in your life, because if you do it, chances are it's going to be illegal and you're going to put yourself into legal jeopardy. So let's talk first of all about the politicians. Now, I ran across a study a couple years ago. It was sent to me by an economist friend. It was an academic study done in something called the Journal of Quantitative Economics. Now, believe me, if you have trouble sleeping at night, this is a great resource. It has a lot of mathematical formulas, but here's what this study did. It took 6,000 stock trades by United States senators, and they evaluated how good were senators as stock investors. Well, the study pointed out that the average corporate executive that trades their own company's stock tends to beat stock market averages by about 5% a year. That's pretty good, right? 5% a year. The study found that hedge funds, you know, the guys that get paid the big money to take all kinds of risks and have these algorithms to make these investments, they tend to beat the stock market average by 7 to 8% a year. And the United States Senate, well, they beat the market on average by 12% a year. Now, when I saw that study, I was left with a dilemma because I basically had two choices. I either had to come to the conclusion that the senators in Washington were far more brilliant and financially skilled than I had ever imagined, or that something else was up. And what I quickly figured out is that something else was up. Let me just give you a couple of examples, real examples. I'm going to name names that give you an indication of how this works. The first one is the IPO. Anybody out there familiar with an IPO? Okay, initial public offering of stock. We recently had the case of Facebook. This is where a company that's been privately held decides to issue stock and become public. And if it's the right stock, you can make a lot of money by getting in early on an IPO. Well, in the context of Washington, D.C., IPO can also mean invest in politicians often. And the reason I say that is this, and I'll just give you one illustration. Let's assume that the gentleman at the front table here is a United States Senator, and I go into his office and I need a favor. And I, Senator, I need a favor, and by the way, I brought a shoebox that has $20,000 of cold hard cash in it. Can you do me a favor? Okay, what's going to happen if we get caught? We're going to jail. It's called bribery. And that is really one of the sort of crude, illegal attempts that people use at bribery. And the reality is that there are far more effective tools than that. Because you see, if I went into that same senator's office and I said, Senator, you know what, I need a favor, and oh, by the way, I'm connected with this company that's going to go public, and I can get you 5,000 shares of this stock, which you can buy for $20 a share, and the day it goes public, you're going to more than double your money and you can sell the stock. That's legal. And that has gone on for a long time in Washington, D.C. Now, in my book, I illustrate a number of cases. One of those involves former Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi. And for anybody who saw the segment on 60 Minutes, which was based on my book, there was a point where Steve Kroft of 60 Minutes asked Pelosi about this stock IPO, at which you got sort of the classical deer in the headlights moment from Nancy Pelosi, where I think perhaps for the first time in her career she was actually speechless. But you see, here's what happened with Nancy Pelosi. She was Speaker of the House in March of 2008. Visa, the credit card company, was going to be going public. They were concerned about legislation in the House. So what happened? Nancy Pelosi and her husband were given access to 5,000 shares of IPO stock in Visa. They got to buy it at $44 a share. The next day when it went public, it was trading at $66 a share. And with a matter of months, it was over $90 a share. They made over $100,000 in a day just on that one deal. And what I was able to find is at least 10 other instances where Nancy Pelosi was the recipient of these kind of sweetheart IPO deals. And that explains in part why she and her husband tend to be such impressive investors when it comes to the stock market. Let me give you another example. Insider trading. Many people here that invest in the stock market or work for companies and they get stock options or they own stock in the company they work for are familiar with this. You cannot use what they call non-public material information to trade stock. If you work in the accounting department of a large corporation and you find out that the company is going to report a bad quarterly loss in a week before the public knows it, you go and sell stock so you can avoid a loss. If you are caught, that is insider trading. But you see, if you're a politician and you are working to reform or transform 20% of the American economy, like the healthcare sector in 2009, you are free to buy and sell stock in healthcare companies while you are doing that. And indeed, in 2009, when Obamacare was being debated in the House and the Senate, you literally had tens of congressmen and senators who were making multi-million-dollar bets, use that term bets loosely, on the healthcare sector. And guess what? They tended to choose right most of the time. So, for example, Senator John Kerry from Massachusetts, who sits on the Budget Committee in the Senate on healthcare, where the Obamacare legislation originated, he and his wife, their investment funds, were actively and aggressively trading healthcare stock. And you know what? They picked the right winners and they dumped the right losers, and their timing was impeccable. Here in Colorado, you have a Congressman, Jared Polis from Boulder, who sits on a very powerful committee, the Ways and Means Committee. He also sits on an education committee that, again, played a key role in developing the Obamacare healthcare legislation. Now, you remember during that debate that Nancy Pelosi said that we had to pass the bill to figure out what was in it, right? You remember that? Well, there were people that knew what was in it, and that included Congressman Jared Polis. And that, I would argue, motivated him to make some very, very large, multi-million-dollar investments in the healthcare sector at the very time he was pushing for amending and supporting the Obamacare legislation. Just to give you two examples. He makes a multi-million-dollar investment, between $7 and $35 million, in the summer of 2009 in something called Bridge Health International. It's a Colorado-based company. What does Bridge Health do? It is a medical tourism company. Medical tourism says if you're having trouble with your insurance company or the cost is too high to, have pancreas surgery, this company will arrange for you to get surgery in Costa Rica or Brazil or in Europe for a fraction of the cost. That's medical tourism. And you know what's interesting is the congressman made this equity purchase of this company, and medical tourism, that industry, was one of the biggest winners in Obamacare passage, and they admitted so themselves. So here you have a member of Congress who has read the legislation, who knows what's in it, makes an investment that essentially is saying that Obamacare is going to make health care less affordable, less accessible, and he's putting his money where his mouth is and investing in a medical tourism company. Completely legal and ethical by the standards of Washington to do. But it gets worse, because you see, embedded within that large health care bill, there are a couple of sentences that relate to the biotech industry. Now, the biotech industry produces a number of products, including pharmaceuticals. And what was in those couple of sentences of this large, massive bill were enormously important to the biotech sector. Because you see, what those lines embedded in this bill that hardly anybody knew was in it said was that while most pharmaceutical companies that produce drugs get a 5-year patent protection, but the biopharmaceutical industry, with the passage of this bill, was now going to get 12 years of protection on their patents. A huge boon to the biotech industry, and that again was not lost on Congressman Paulus, who made a multi-million-dollar investment in biotech sector stocks. And of course, when Obamacare was passed and people realized that this provision was in it, the stock rose, the sector fund rose by 25%, which is a pretty good return on investment. So you see what's happening here. People are able to use the access that they have to information, to what government is doing in the private sector, and they are able to profit from it enormously. It's an enormous cultural problem, and it explains in part, I would say, why it is that government continues to grow and grow and grow. Whether Republicans or Democrats are in charge, the direction seems to only be one way. And I think the answer is very clear and very crude. And that is, follow the money. The simple fact is there's no money to be made in Washington by shrinking government. All the money is to be made by expanding government. Now, don't get me wrong, there are good people in Washington fighting the good fight. But there are also good people in Washington, or people that were good people in Washington, that over time have been corroded, and I would argue have been seduced by the culture. There's a former congressman who told me that, you got to understand Washington this way. He said, when you first get there, it's a cesspool. But after you hang around for a while, it becomes a hot tub. And that's really what you have in Washington, D.C. And you see, it's a cultural problem. There's a study that was done recently that estimates 30 U.S. senators, that's almost 1 out of 3 U.S. senators, has an immediate family member in Washington who is a registered lobbyist. All right? Harry Reid from Nevada has 4 sons and a son-in-law who are registered lobbyists in Washington, D.C. So forget about ideology for a minute. Where's the money going to be made in the Reid family? Forget his philosophy and his ideology and his party identification. Just think about where the money is to be made. On the Republican side, Congressman John Mica from Florida is not quite as good, but he has 4 family members that are registered lobbyists. There is an industrial logic to big government, and I think it explains why things continue to go in a direction other than the one we want it to go. The final area I want to look at in terms of politician self-enrichment is what I call the land deal. And the example here I'm going to give you is the example of Dennis Hastert when he was Speaker of the House. And again, what he did is not only legal, but is deemed ethical by the ethical poobahs in Washington, D.C. You see, when Dennis Hastert was Speaker of the House, the most powerful man in Congress, In February of 2004, he and a couple of friends decided to buy 600 acres of farmland in rural Illinois, land that was sort of out in the middle of nowhere. That's February of 2004. 2 months later, the Speaker of the House inserts an earmark into the federal transportation bill. And what this earmark does is provide $220 million of our money to build something called the Prairie Parkway. Now, this is a very smart crowd. I know that. Anybody want to guess where the Prairie Parkway was going to run? That's right. It was going to run right by the 600 plus acres that he had bought with his friends. And of course, when it became known that there was going to be a nice new highway going right by this property, it was no longer out in the middle of nowhere. And within a matter of 1 year, Hastert was able to take his investment and make 150% profit. His personal take was around $2 million. Again, completely legal, completely ethical. And it goes on all the time. Nancy Pelosi has done it. Other people have done it. It's the sort of thing that, again, is enrichment at our expense. Now, I've talked about the politicians. Politicians tend to be fairly easy to criticize in the abstract and to look at from the standpoint of enrichment. But let me talk about the financier. Now, by financiers, I mean people that are investors, that exhibit the sort of qualities that we conservatives, I think, would tend to endorse, and that is entrepreneurship, creativity, the development of new products and technologies and services. The problem is that there has been a corrosion or corruption of that sector over the last 10 years, and it has come in the form of all sorts of wonderful names. Some of them are public-private partnerships. Some of them are pro-business initiatives, to which I always say we should not be pro-business, we should be pro-free market. They are two different things. But what has happened is that this sector of the economy, finance and businesses, have started to learn that given the growth in the size of government, they are better off increasingly investing in lobbyists and campaign contributions than they are in new technologies, new products, or new personnel. And the returns on investment are enormous. Let me just give you one illustration from the energy sector. All right, you remember in 2009, the stimulus was passed. A centerpiece of that stimulus was President Obama's commitment to develop green energy technologies. A lot of you have heard about Solyndra, right? The company that got $535 million in taxpayer money and went bankrupt. Well, we're missing the beat if we think that the story of Solyndra is simply about a boneheaded government use of taxpayer money. Because you see, the real purpose of the green energy stimulus program was to function as what I call an Obama recycling program. And it was Obama's attempt, successful attempt, to recycle taxpayer money back to individuals who helped put him in office in 2008. So in the case of Solyndra, of course, the largest equity owner in that investment was a gentleman named George Kaiser, who was a bundler for the Obama campaign, a bundler being someone who bundles and raises a lot of money. But you see, George Kaiser is just the tip of the iceberg. If you go through the list of all the people that received grants and loans in programs like the one that Solyndra got money from, you come to an astonishing fact. And I've done this. I had researchers go through this. It's in the book. It was reported in Newsweek and elsewhere. If you look at which energy companies got taxpayer loans and grants, 80% of them are companies where either the largest investor or the corporate executive was a bundler or a member of Barack Obama's 2008 National Campaign Finance Committee. Think about that for a second. We're talking about at least a dozen bundlers, George Kaiser being just one of them, and we're talking about at least 10 members of his National Campaign Finance Committee in 2008. And they got enormous returns on their investment. In fact, if you look at these members of the Finance Committee and the bundlers, how much money they brought into the campaign and how much they got in return in our money provided by the Obama administration, you find that they got a 22,000% return on their investment. Anybody out here take that? Of course, it's cronyism and it's corruption. And those who say that, well, this is just sort of, an anomaly, it just sort of happened, it's ridiculous when you realize how this green energy program was set up. The impression a lot of people have is that when the Department of Energy is doling out tens of billions of dollars, they've got engineers and scientists who are looking at these applications, evaluating them, and they're making the decisions on those merits. That's hogwash. Okay, it was made by 5 political appointees, several of whom were campaign fundraisers who had raised money from the very people who are now getting the government money back. You see how it's a recycling program? The decision makers were not engineers and scientists, they were political appointees. And some of those political appointees ended up going to work for entities that they had given government money to less than a year before. Let me just give you a couple of examples of what I'm talking about in terms of the absurd examples. Number one, there's a company called Leucadia Energy. Okay, Leucadia Energy, all you need to know about it is that in 2009, according to its own records, it had 1 employee and $120,000 in revenue. Yet, it was approved for more than $3 billion, that's billion with a B, dollars of government money for various clean energy green projects. Now, how on earth does that happen? Well, I think it happens because the chairman of Leucadia Energy is a gentleman named Ian Cumming, who was on Barack Obama's National Campaign Finance Committee. Give you another example, Bright Source Energy. Now, Bright Source Energy in 2010 filed with the Securities and Exchange Commission and said they had a total of $13 million in revenue. They were losing $74 million a year. They were $1.8 billion in debt. And they were spending 6 times more on publicity than they were on research and development. And yet this company was approved for $1.6 billion in taxpayer money to build a solar facility out in California. How on earth did they get this money? Well, the largest equity owners of Bright Source is a gentleman named Robert Kennedy Jr. of the famous family, and his business partner is a gentleman named Sanjay Wadle, who was at the Department of Energy advising the green energy program when that loan was approved. So you see how that works? So this is the reality that we are facing in America today, and that is that increasingly, we are moving from free market capitalism to crony capitalism. We are moving in a direction away from innovation and towards a direction where who you know in the government and which lobbyists you hire can have more to determine the success of your company than coming up with new innovative products and new innovative services that customers want to spend money for. And I'm going to continue today, there's a lot of rhetoric thrown out by the left between the 99% and the 1%. I would argue there is a 99% and 1%, but it's not the way they define it. They define it by wealth. That 1% are people that are enormously successful. Here's the problem with that, okay? The late Steve Jobs of Apple Computer, I happen to like Apple products. This is a gentleman who produced products and services and goods that people voluntarily decided to buy. Steve Jobs could not force anybody to buy his products, and that's what made him as successful and as wealthy as he was. The real 1% in America is not determined by wealth, it's determined by cronyism and insider connections. Because you see, the crony makes his money not by providing a good or service, by providing something that people want. They get it by manipulating government, by either getting loans or grants, or by creating a market where one didn't exist before. Let me give you just a couple of examples to show you how deeply embedded these are. The first one, remember the debate, President Obama's mandate that the Health and Human Services was going to require that all people be able to get contraceptives coverage in their health care plan. And this set off a large debate, a very important debate on the issue of religious liberty. And that's really what the debate was about. But you know what? I don't think that Barack Obama's ultimate motivation was to tick off Catholics and tick off evangelicals. Think for a second, why would Barack Obama do that? The reason that Barack Obama did that is it created an enormous new market for the pharmaceutical industry, and particularly for companies who had people that were bundling a lot of money for them, like Pfizer. Think about it for a second from the standpoint of companies that produce contraceptives. And we're not talking about low-cost contraceptives. We're talking about new, expensive procedures. Because you see, the Obama mandate says that any FDA-approved contraceptive has to be covered by health insurance companies with no copay and no deductible. Talk about a boon to contraceptive manufacturers. And that, I would contend you, is what that decision was really about. Let me give you a second example, which I think will surprise you as well. We've had an enormous growth in food stamps in America under President. Newt Gingrich called President Obama the food stamp president because we have more than doubled the number of people that are on food stamps. Let me ask you, though, are there initially, beyond the sort of liberal advocacy groups that would argue that we need to continue to loosen standards and we don't need to be concerned about fraud with food stamps, can you think of anybody else who might take that similar position? Well, that is companies that have come to see food stamps as an enormous revenue source. 26 states in this country, the EBT card, which is the sort of credit card that has replaced the actual paper food stamps. In 26 states, that EBT card and the food stamp program is managed by J.P. Morgan, the Wall Street investment firm. Think about that for a second. J.P. Morgan, every time somebody signs up for food stamps, they get a $60 flat fee. Every time somebody uses their ABT debit card or a government assistance card, they make between 75 and 95 cents per transaction. Do you think that given their revenue model, they're interested in tightening standards or they're interested in coming with anti-fraud procedures? Of course not. And that explains in part why J.P. Morgan lobbies the agriculture committees on the food stamps issue. It's become a revenue stream and a revenue source for them. Now, I've painted a very sort of bleak picture here, a depressing picture here, but I have to tell you that I'm actually quite optimistic when it comes to this issue, and here's why. I believe that the fundamental issue when it comes to big government that is going to lead to success on those who believe in limited government is the simple fact that big government inevitably leads to cronyism and corruption. And I have not found one person, conservative, liberal, moderate, apolitical, who thinks that cronyism and corruption are good and okay. And I would contend to you that the philosophical debate that we're having in the country today is very, very important, and we need to continue to have it, but we need to continue to insist and start to raise the fact that there is a logic behind all of this and that people are making money through cronyism and corruption through the growth of large government. And you're not going to fix it by changing laws. You're not going to fix it by changing individual congressmen. You're going to fix it by shrinking the size of government. And let me say to you, I'm also optimistic because Washington, D.C. is frightened to death of this issue. This is part of the reason I live in Florida, not Washington, D.C. They hate this issue. And let me just give you one illustration of it. The book came out in November. 60 Minutes had done this episode. Eventually, as a result of that, Congress would pass the Stock Act, which now makes it a crime for members of Congress to engage in insider trading. I have problems with the bill. Thank you. I have problems with the bill. It's not perfect, but it's a step forward. But in the midst of that, in November of last year, I was at the Fox Studios in Washington to go on a show, and in the green room walked Senator Kent Conrad from North Dakota, chairman of the Senate Budget Committee. He came over and introduced himself. He said, "Hi, I'm Senator Conrad." I said, "Hi, I'm Peter Schweizer." Silence. But you know what he did the next 7 minutes? He tried to convince me. Now, he's one of the most powerful people in Washington, chairman of the Senate Budget Committee. You know what he tried to do in the next 7 minutes? Convince me how bad his stock portfolio had performed and how bad his real estate investments had done. That is fear, and that's what gives me ground for optimism. Thank you very much. Thank you.